Hi, Anne, and welcome to the Information Bottleneck. I have to say, this is a bit weird for me. Like, I've known you for almost 5 years, and we've worked closely together, but this is the first time that I'm interviewing you for a podcast, right? Usually our conversations are more like, Yann, it doesn't work, what I should do. Okay, so even though I'm sure all of our audience knows you, I will say Yann LeCun is a Turing Award winner, one of the godfathers of deep learning, the inventors of convolutional neural networks, founder of Meta's fundamental AI research lab, and still their chief AI scientist and a professor at NYU. So welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
And it's a pleasure for me to be anywhere near you. I have been, in this industry for a lot less time than either one of you, and doing research for a lot less time. So the fact that I'm able to publish papers somewhat regularly with Wayve has been an honor, and to be able to start hosting this podcast has been even more of one. So it's really a pleasure to sit down with you.
Awesome.
So we'll start congratulations on the new startup. Right? You recently announced that after 12 years at Meta, you're starting a new startup, Advanced Machine Intelligence, that will focus on world model. So first of all, how does it feel to be in the other side, going from a big company to starting something from scratch?
Well, I co-founded companies before. I was, involved more peripherally than this new one, but I know how this works. What's unique about this one is a new phenomenon where there is enough hope from the part of investors that AI will have a big impact, that they are ready to invest a lot of money, essentially, which means now you can create a startup where the first couple of years are essentially focused on research. That just was not possible before. Like, the only place to do research in industry before was in a large company that was, not fighting for its survival, and basically had a dominant position in this market, and had a long enough view that they were willing to fund long-term projects. So from history, the big labs that we remember, like Bell Labs, belonged to AT&T, which basically had a monopoly on telecommunication in the US. IBM had a monopoly on big computers, essentially, right? And they had a good research lab. Xerox has a monopoly on photocopiers, and that enabled them to fund PARC. Did not enable them to profit from the research going on there, but that profited Apple. And then more recently, Microsoft Research, Google Research, and FAIR at Meta. And the industry is, shifting again. FAIR had a big influence on AI, the AI research ecosystem, by essentially being very open, right? Publishing everything, open sourcing everything, with tools like PyTorch, but also like research prototypes that a lot of people have been using in the industry. So we caused other labs like Google to become more open, and other labs to also kind of publish much more systematically than before. But what's been happening over the last couple of years is that a lot of those labs have been kind of climbing up and becoming more secretive. And that's certainly the case. I mean, that was the case for OpenAI several years ago, and now Google is becoming more closed, and possibly even Meta. So it was time for the type of stuff that I'm interested in to kind of do it outside Meta than inside.
So to be clear, then, does AMI, Advanced Machine Intelligence, plan to do their research in the open?
Yeah, the upstream research. I mean, in my opinion, you cannot really call it research unless you publish what you do, because otherwise you can get easily fooled by yourself. You come up with something, you think it's the best thing since sliced bread. Okay, if you don't actually submit it to the rest of the community, you might just be delusional. And I've seen that phenomenon many times, in lots of industry research lab where there's sort of internal hype about, some internal projects without kind of realizing that other people are doing things that actually are better, right? So if you tell the scientists, like, publish your work, first of all, that is an incentive for them to do better work that is more, where the methodology is kind of more thorough and the results are kind of more reliable, the research is more reliable. It's good for them because very often when you work on a research project, the impact you may have on product could be months, years, or decades down the line. And you cannot tell people, like, come work for us, don't say what you're working on, and maybe there is a product you will have an impact on 5 years from now. Like in the meantime, like they can't be motivated to really do something useful. So if you tell them that, they tend to work on things that have a short-term impact, right? So if you really want breakthroughs, you need to let people publish. You can't do it any other way. And this is something that a lot of the industry is forgetting at the moment.
Does AMI, what products, if any, does AMI plan to produce or make? Is it research or more than that?
No, it's more than that. It's actual products. Okay. But things that have to do with world models and, planning and basically we have the ambition of becoming kind of one of the main suppliers of intelligence systems down the line. We think the current architectures that are employed, LLMs or, agentic systems that are based on LLMs, work okay for language. Agentic systems really don't work very well. They require a lot of data to basically clone the behavior of humans, and they're not that reliable. So we think the proper way to handle this, and I've been saying this for almost 10 years now, is have world models that are capable of predicting what would be the consequence or the consequences of an action or a sequence of actions that an AI system might take. And then the system arrives at a sequence of actions or an output by optimization, by figuring out what sequence of actions will optimally accomplish a task that I'm setting for myself. That's planning. Okay, so I think an essential part of intelligence is being able to predict the consequences of your actions and then use them for planning. And that's what I've been working on for many years. We've been making fast progress with a combination of projects here at NYU and also at Meta. And now it's time to basically make it real.
And what do you think are the missing parts, and why you think it's taking so long? Because you're talking about it, as you said, for many years already, but it's still not better than LLMs, right?
So, it's not the same thing as LLM, right? It's designed to handle modalities that are high-dimensional, continuous, and noisy. And LLMs completely suck at this. They really do not work, right? If you try to train an LLM to kind of learn good representations of images or video, they're really not that great. Generally, vision capabilities for AI systems, right, are trained separately. They're not part of the whole LLM thing. So, yeah, if you want to handle data that is high-dimensional, continuous, and noisy, you cannot use generative models. You can certainly not use generative models that tokenize your data into kind of discrete symbols. Okay, it's just no way. And we have a lot of empirical evidence that this simply doesn't work very well. What does work is learning an abstract representation space that eliminates a lot of details about the input, essentially all the details that are not predictable, which includes noise, and make predictions in that representation space. And this is the idea of JEPA, right? Joint embedding predictive architectures, which you're as familiar with as I am, because you work on this a lot.
Yeah.
So
also Randall was hosted in the podcast.
Randall
Vecchiarello
also was in the podcast. I probably talked about this at length. So there's a lot of ideas around this, and let me tell you my history around this. Okay, had been convinced for a long time, probably the better part of 20 years, that the proper way to building intelligent systems was through some form of unsupervised learning. I started working on unsupervised learning as the basis for, making progress in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. Before that, I wasn't so convinced this was the way to go. And and basically, this was the idea of training autoencoders to learn representations, right? So you have an input, you run it to an encoder, it finds a representation of it, and then you decode. So you guarantee that the representation contains all the information about the input. Turns out that intuition is wrong. Like, insisting that the representation contains all the information about the input is a bad idea. Okay, I didn't know this at the time. So what we worked on was, you have several ways of doing this. Jeff Hinton at the time was working on restricted Boston machines. Yosha Benjo was working on denoising autoencoders, which actually became quite successful in different contexts, right, for NLP, among others. And I was working on sparse autoencoders. So basically, if you train an autoencoder, you need to regularize the representation so that the autoencoder does not trivially learn an identity function. And this is the information bottleneck podcast. This is about information bottleneck, right? You need to create an information bottleneck to limit the information content of the representation. And I thought high-dimensional sparse representations was actually a good way to go. So, so a bunch of my students did their PhD on this. Koray Kavucholu, who is now the chief AI architect at Alphabet, and also the CTO at DeepMind, actually did his PhD on this with me. And a few other folks, Marco Ronzetto and Ilan Bro and a few others. So this was kind of the idea. And then, as it turned out, and the reason why we worked on this was because we wanted to pre-train very deep neural nets by pre-training those things as autoencoders. We thought that was the way to go. What happened though was that we started experimenting with things like normalization, rectification instead of hyperbole, tangent, or sigmoids, like ReLUs. Mm-hmm. And that ended up, basically allowing us to train fairly deep network, completely supervised. So self-supervised learning, and this was at the same time that data sets started to get bigger. And so it turned out supervised learning worked fine. So the whole idea of self-supervised or unsupervised learning was put aside. And then came ResNet, and that's completely solved the problem of training very deep architectures, right? In 2015. But then in 2015, I started, thinking again about how do we push towards human level AI, which really was the original objective of FAIR, really, and my life, mission. And realized that all the approaches of reinforcement learning and things of that type were basically not scaling. Reinforcement learning is incredibly inefficient in terms of samples, and so this was not the way to go. And so the idea of world models, right, a system that can predict the consequences of its action and can plan. I started really seriously playing with this around 2015, 16. My keynote at what was still called NIPS at the time, in 2016, was on world model. I was arguing for it. That was basically the centerpiece of my talk, was this is what we should be working on, world models, action condition. And a few of my students started working on this, on video prediction and things like that. We had some papers on video prediction in 2016. And I made the same mistake as before, and the same mistake that everybody is doing at the moment, which is training a video prediction system to predict at the pixel level, which is really impossible. And you can't really represent useful probability distributions on the space of video frames. And so those things don't work. I knew for a fact that because the prediction was non-deterministic, we had to have a model with latent variables, okay, to represent all the stuff you don't know about the variable you're supposed to predict. And so we experimented with this for years. I had a student here who is now a scientist at FAIR, Michael Enaf, who developed a video prediction system with latent variables. And it kind of solved this problems we were facing slightly. I mean, today, the solution that a lot of people are employing is diffusion models, which is a way to train a non-deterministic function, essentially, or energy-based models, which I've been advocating for decades now, which also is another way of training non-deterministic functions. But in the end, I discovered that this was all about the idea that the way to get around the fact that you really can't predict at the pixel level is to just not predict at the pixel level. is to run a representation and predict at a representation level, eliminating all the details you cannot predict. And I wasn't really thinking about those methods early on because I thought there was a huge problem of preventing collapse. So I'm sure Randall talked about this, but when you train, let's say you have an observed variable X, and you're trying to predict a variable Y, but you don't want to predict all the details, right? So you run both X and Y through encoders. So now you have both a representation for X, SX, and a representation for Y, SY. You can train a predictor to predict the representation of Y from the representation of X. But if you want to train this whole thing end-to-end simultaneously, there's a trivial solution where the system ignores the input and produces constant representations. And the predictor's problem now is trivial, right? So if your only criterion to train the system is minimize the prediction error, it's not going to work. It's going to collapse. I knew about this problem for a very long time because I worked on joint embedding architectures. We used to call them Siamese networks back in the 90s.
Those are the same because people have been using that term Siamese networks even recently.
That's right. I mean, the concept is still, up to date, right? So you have an X and a Y, and think of the X as some sort of degraded, transformed, or corrupted version of Y, okay? You run both X and Y through encoders, and you tell the system, look, X and Y really are two views of the same thing, so whatever representation you compute should be the same, right? So if you just train a neural net, two neural nets with shared weights, right, to produce the same representation for slightly different versions of the same object, view, whatever it is, it collapses. It doesn't produce anything useful. So you have to find a way to make sure that the system, extract as much information from the input as possible. And the original idea that we had, it was a newspaper from 1993 with Siamese net, was to have a contrastive term, right? So you have other pairs of samples that are different, and you train the system to produce different representations. So you have a cost function that attracts the two representations when you show two examples that are identical or similar, and you repel them when you show it two examples that are dissimilar. And we came up with this idea because someone came to us and said, like, can you encode signatures of someone, drawing a signature on a tablet? Can you encode this on less than 80 bytes? Because if you can encode it in less than 80 bytes, we can write it on the magnetic tape of a credit card. And we can do signature verification for credit cards, right? And so we came up with this idea. I came up with this idea of training a neural net to produce 80 variables that were quantized on 1 byte each, and then training it to kind of do this thing.
And did they use it?
So it worked really well, and they showed it to their, business people who said, we're just going to ask people to type pin codes.
We have a lesson of how you can integrate technology.
Right. And, I knew this thing was kind of fishy in the first place because, there were countries in Europe that were using smart cards, right? And it was a much better solution to the problem, but they just didn't want to use smart cards for some reason. Anyway, so we had this technology in the mid-2000s. I worked with two of my students to revise this idea. We came up with sort of new objective functions to train those. So those are what people now call contrastive methods. It's a special case of contrastive methods. We have positive examples, negative examples, and you train, on positive examples, you train the system to have low energy, and for negative samples, you train them to have higher energy, where energy is the distance between the representations. So we had two papers at CVPR in 2005, 2006 by Raya Hatzel, who is now the head of DeepMind Foundation, the sort of Fairlike division of DeepMind, if you want, and Sumit Chopra, who is actually a faculty here at NYU now, working on medical imaging. And so this gathered a bit of interest in the community and sort of revived a little bit of work on those ideas. But it still wasn't working very well. Those contrastive methods really were producing representations of images, for example, that were kind of relatively low dimensional. If we measured like those, the eigenvalue spectrum of the covariance matrix of the representations that came out of those things, it would fill up maybe 200 dimensions, never more. Like even training on ImageNet and things like that, even with data augmentation. And so that was kind of disappointing. And it did work. Okay, there was a bunch of papers on this, and it worked okay. There was one paper from DeepMind, SimClear, that demonstrated you could get decent performance with contrastive training applied to Siamese nets. But then, about 5 years ago, one of my postdocs, Stéphane Denis at Meta, tried an idea that at first I didn't think would work, which was to essentially have some measure of information quantity that comes out of the encoder, and then trying to maximize that. Okay. And the reason I didn't think it would work is because I'd seen a lot of experiments along those lines that Jeff Hinton was doing in the 1980s, trying to sort of maximize information. And you can never maximize information because you never have appropriate measures of information content that is a lower bound. If you want to maximize something, you want to either be able to compute it or you want a lower bound on it so you can push it up, right? And for information content, we only have upper bounds. So I always thought this was completely hopeless. And then, Stéphane came up with a technique, and which was called Barlow twins. Barlow is a famous theoretical neuroscientist who came up with the idea of information maximization. And it kind of worked. It was, wow. So then I said, we have to push this, right? So we came up with another method with a student of mine, Adrien Bard, co-advised with Jean Ponce, who's affiliated with NYU too. Technique called VICREG, variance, invariance, covariance, regularization. And that turned out to be simpler and work even better. And since then, we made progress. And Randall recently, I discussed an idea with him that can be pushed and made practical. It's called SIGREG. The whole system is called JEPA. Okay, yeah. He's responsible for the name. I don't really that means latent Euclidean JEPA, right?
Yeah.
And SIGREG has to do with sort of making sure that the distribution of vectors that come out of the encoder is an isotropic Gaussian. That's the I and the G. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things happening in this domain which are really cool. I think there's going to be some more progress over the next year or two. We've get a lot of experience with this, and I think that's kind of a really good, promising set of techniques to train models that learn abstract representations, which I think is key.
And what do you think are the missing parts here? Do you think more compute will help, or we need better algorithms, or it's kind of do you believe in the bitter lessons, right? Do you think?
Well, and furthermore, what do you think about, the data quality problems with the internet post 2022, right? I've heard people compare it to low background steel now to refer to all that data before LLMs came out, like low background tokens, I mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm totally escaping that problem. Okay, here's the thing, and I've been using this argument publicly over the last couple of years. Training an LLM, if you wanted to have any kind of decent performance, requires training on basically all the freely available text on the internet, plus some synthetic data, plus licensed data, etc. So a typical LLM, Llama 3, going back a year or two, is trained on 30 trillion tokens. A token is typically 3 bytes, so that's 10 to the 14 bytes for pre-training. Okay, we're not talking about fine-tuning. 10 to the 14 bytes. And for the LLMs to be able to really kind of exploit this, they need to have a lot of memory storage, because basically those are isolated facts. There is a little bit of redundancy in text, but a lot of it is just isolated facts, right? And so you need very big networks because you need a lot of memory to store all those facts and regurgitate them. Okay, now compare this with video. 10 to the 14 bytes if you count 2 megabytes per second for video, for relatively compressed video, not highly compressed, but a bit. That would represent 15,000 hours of video. 10 to the 14 bytes. In 15,000 hours of video, you have the same amount of data as the entirety of all the text available on the internet. Now, 15,000 hours of video is absolutely nothing. It's 30 minutes of YouTube uploads. Okay. It's the amount of visual information that a 4-year-old has seen in his or her life, entire life, waking time, is about 16,000 hours in 4 years. It's not a lot of information. We have video models now, JEPA 2, actually, that just came out last summer. That was trained on the equivalent of a century of video data, and it's all public data. Okay, much more data, but much less than the biggest LLM, actually, because even though it's more bytes, it's more redundant. So you say, okay, it's more redundant, so it's less useful. Actually, when you use self-supervised learning, you do need redundancy. You cannot learn anything in self-supervised, or anything, by the way, if it's completely random. Redundancy is what you can learn. And so, so there's just much richer structure in real-world data like video than there is in text, which kind of led me to claim that we absolutely never, ever going to get to human-level AI by just training on text. It's just never going to happen, right? So it's this big debate in philosophy of whether AI should be grounded in reality or whether it could be just, in the realm of symbolic manipulation and things like this.
Well, and when we talk about for world models and grounding, I think, there's still a lot of people who don't even understand what the idealized world model is, in a sense, right? So, for example, I'm influenced by having watched Star Trek, which I would hope you've seen a little bit of, and thinking of the holodecks, right? I always thought that the holodeck was like an idealized perfect world model, right? Even so many episodes of it going too far, right? And people walking out of it, right? But it even simulates things like smell and physical touch. So do you think that something like that is like the idealized world model, or do you think like a different model or like way of defining it would be?
Okay, this is an excellent question. And the reason it's excellent is because it goes to the core of really what I think we should be doing, which I'm doing, and how wrong I think everybody else is. Okay, so people think that a world model is something that reproduces all details of what the world does. They think of it as a simulator.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, because deep learning is the thing, you're going to use some deep learning system as a simulator. A lot of people also are focused on video generation, which is kind of a cool thing, right? You produce those cool videos and wow, people are sort of really impressed by them. Now, there's no guarantee whatsoever that when you train a video generation system, it actually has an accurate model of the underlying dynamics of the world, and it's learned anything, particularly abstract about it. And so the idea that somehow a model needs to reproduce every detail of reality is wrong and hurtful. And I'm going to tell you why. Okay. A good example of simulation is CFD, computational fluid dynamics. It's used all the time. People use supercomputers for that, right? So you want to simulate the flow of air around an airplane. You cut up the space into little cubes, and within each cube you have a small vector that represents the state of that cube, which is velocity, density or mass, and temperature, and maybe a couple other things, right? So, and then you solve Navier-Stokes equations, which is a partial differential equation, and you can simulate the flow of air. Now, the thing is, this does not actually necessarily solve the equations very accurately. If you have chaotic behavior like turbulences and stuff like that, simulation is only, approximately correct. But in fact, that's already an abstract representation of the underlying phenomenon. The underlying phenomenon is molecules of air that bump into each other and bump on the wing and on the airplane, right? But nobody ever goes to that level to do the simulation. That would be crazy, right? It would require an amount of computation that's just insane. And it would depend on the initial conditions. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons we don't do this. And maybe it's not molecules. Maybe it's, at a lower level, we should simulate particles and do the Feynman diagrams and simulate, all the different paths that those particles are employing, because they don't take one path, right? It's not classical, it's quantum, right?
Yeah.
So at the bottom, it's like quantum field theory, and probably already that is an abstract representation of the underlying reality. So, everything that takes place between us at the moment, in principle, can be described through quantum field theory. Okay, we just have to measure the wave function of the universe in a cube that contains all of us, and even that would not be sufficient because there are untangled particles at the other side of the universe that we have. So it wouldn't be sufficient. But let's imagine, okay, for the sake of the argument, first of all, we would not be able to measure this wave function, and second of all, the amount of computation we would need to devote to this is absolutely gigantic. Would be some gigantic quantum computer that is the size of the Earth or something. So no way we can describe anything at that level, and it's very likely that our simulation would be accurate for maybe a few nanoseconds. And, beyond that, we'll diverge from reality. So what do? We invent abstractions. We invent abstractions like particles, atoms, molecules. In the living world, it's proteins, organelles, cells, organs, organisms, societies, ecosystems, etc. Right? And basically, every level in this hierarchy ignores a lot of details about the level below. And what that allows us to do is make longer-term, more reliable longer-term predictions. Okay, so we can describe the dynamics between us now in terms of the underlying science and in terms of psychology. Okay, that's a much, much higher level of abstraction than particle physics, right? And in fact, every level in the hierarchy I just mentioned is a different field of science. A field of science is essentially defined by the level of abstraction at which you start making predictions, right? That you allow yourself to use to make predictions. In fact, physicists have this down to an art, in the sense that, if I give you a box full of gas, you could, in principle, simulate all the molecules of the gas, right? But nobody ever does this. But at a very abstract level, we can say, PV equals nRT, right? Pressure times volume equals, number of particle times, temperature, blah, blah, blah. And so that at a, global emergent phenomenological level, if you increase the pressure, the temperature will go up. Or if you increase the temperature, the pressure will go up, right? Or if you let some particles out, then the pressure will go down, and blah, 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 right? So we, all the time, we build phenomenological models of something complicated by ignoring all kinds of details that physicists call entropy. But it's really systematic. That's the way we understand the world. We do not memorize every detail of, we certainly don't reconstruct it, of what we perceive.
So world models don't have to be simulators at all.
Well, there are simulators, but in abstract representation space, and what they simulate is only the relevant part of reality. Okay, if I ask you, where is Jupiter going to be 100 years from now? I mean, we have an enormous amount of information about Jupiter, right? But within this whole information that we have about Jupiter, to be able to make that prediction where Jupiter is going to be 100 years from now, you need exactly 6 numbers, 3 positions and 3 velocities. And the rest doesn't matter.
So you don't believe in synthetic data sets?
I do. No, it's useful. Data from games. I mean, there's certainly a lot of things that you learn from synthetic data, from games and things like that. I mean, children learn a huge amount from play, which basically are kind of simulations of the world a little bit, right? but in conditions where they can't kill themselves.
But I worry, at least for video games, that, for example, the green screen, like actors doing the animations, they're doing extremely. It's designed to look good, for like an often badass, I guess, for an action game, but these often don't correspond very well to reality. And so I worry that like a physical system that's, been trained or with the assistance of world models might get similar quirks, at least in the very short term. Is this something that worries you?
No, it depends at what level you train them. So for example, I mean, sure, if you use a very accurate robotic simulator, for example, right? It's going to accurately simulate the dynamics of an arm. When you apply torques to it, it's going to move in a particular way. There's dynamics, no problem. Now, simulating the friction that happens, when you grab an object and manipulate it, that's super hard to do it accurately. Friction is very hard to simulate. Okay, and so those simulators are not particularly accurate for manipulation. They're good enough that you can train a system to do it, and then you can do sim to real with a little bit of adaptation. So that can work, but it's not. I mean, the point is much more important. Like, for example, there's a lot of completely basic things about the world that we completely take for granted, which we can learn at a very abstract level, but it's not language related. Okay, so the fact, for example, and I've used this example before, and people made fun of me for it, but it's really true. Okay, I have those objects on the table, and the fact that when I push the table, the object moves with it. Like, this is something we learned. It's not something that you're born with. Okay, the fact that most objects will fall when you let them go, right, with gravity. Maybe it's learned this around the age of 9 months. And the reason people make fun of me with this is because I said, LLMs don't understand this kind of stuff, right? And they absolutely do not, even today. But you can train them to give the right answer when you ask them a question. If I put an object on the table and I push the table, what will happen to the object? It will answer, the object moves with it, but because it's been fine-tuned to do that, okay? So it's more like regurgitation than sort of real understanding of the underlying dynamics.
But if you look on, Sora or like Nano, and Nano Banana, they have like good physics of the world, right? They are not perfect.
They have some physics, yeah.
They have some physics,
right?
So do you think like we can push it farther, or do you think like it's a one way to learn physics?
So all of those models actually make predictions in representation space. They use the diffusion transformers, and that prediction, the computation of the video snippet at an abstract level is done in representation space. Okay, not always autoregressively, by the way. Sometimes it's just in parallel. And then there's a second diffusion model that turns these abstract representations into a nice-looking video. And that might be mode collapse. We don't know, right? Because we can't really measure like the coverage of such systems with reality. But like the previous point, I can train. Like, here is another completely obvious concept to us that we don't even imagine that we learn, but we do learn it. A person cannot be in two places at the same time. Okay? Like, we learned this because very early on we learn object permanence, the fact that when an object disappears, it still exists. Okay? And we reappears as the same object that you saw before. How can we train an AI system to learn this concept? So object permanence, you just show it a lot of videos where objects, go behind the screen and then reappear on the other side, or they go behind the screen and the screen goes away and the object is still there. And when you show 4-month-old babies scenarios where things like this are violated, their eyes open like super big and they're like super surprised because reality just, violated their internal model. Same thing when you show a scenario of like a little car on a platform, you push it off the platform and it appears to float in the air. They also look at it. 9 months, 10 months old babies look at it like really surprised. 6 months old baby barely pay attention because they haven't learned about gravity yet. So they haven't been able to incorporate the notion that every object is supposed to fall. So this kind of learning is really what's important. And you do this, you can learn this from very abstract things, the same way babies learn about social interactions by, being told stories with like simple pictures. It's a simulation, an abstract simulation of the world. but it sort of learns them, particular behavior. So you could imagine like training a system from, let's say, an adventure game, like a top-down 2D adventure game, where you tell your character like move north, and he goes to the other room, and it's not in the first room anymore because it moved to the other room, right? Now, of course, in adventure games you also have Gandalf that you can call, and he just appears, right? So that's not physical, but like when you pick up a key from a from a treasure chest, you have the key, no one else can have it, and you can use it to open a door. Like there's a lot of things that you learn that are very basic, even in sort of abstract environments.
Yeah, and I just want to observe that some of those adventure games that they try to train models on, one of them you might know about is NetHack, right?
Sure.
And NetHack is fascinating because it is an extraordinarily hard game.
Right.
Like ever ascending in that game without cheats is like 20 years without going to the wiki. People still don't do it from playing. And my understanding is that AI agents, the very best agent models we have, or even world models, are pathetic.
Totally. Yeah. So to the point, people have come up with sort of, dumbed down version of NetHack.
Yes, exactly.
There's this one called MiniHack.
MiniHack, exactly. MiniHack. They had to dumb it down just for AI agents.
So some of my, colleagues have been working with this. Actually, one of my master's students is working with it. So, and Michael Hinaf, who I mentioned earlier, has been also doing some work there. Now, what's interesting there is that there's a type of situations like this where you need to plan, okay? But you need to plan in the presence of uncertainty. The problem with, all games and adventure games in particular is that you don't have complete visibility of the state of the system. You don't know the map in advance. You need to explore, blah, blah, blah. You can get killed every time you do this. And, but the actions are essentially discrete.
Yes,
okay. There's
correct.
a finite number of possible actions. It's turn-based, and so in that sense, it's like chess, except it's not. Chess is fully observable. Go also is fully observable.
Stratego isn't though.
Stratego isn't. Poker is not.
Yeah.
And so it makes it more difficult if you have uncertainty, of course. But those are games where the number of actions you can take is discrete. And basically, what you need to do is do tree exploration, okay? And to do, of course, the tree of possible states, goes exponentially with the number of moves. And so you have to have some way of generating only the moves that are likely to be good, and basically never generate the other ones, or select them down. And you need to have a value function, which is something that tells you, okay, I can't plan to the end of the game, but even though I'm planning only sort of 9 moves ahead, I have some way of evaluating whether a position is good or bad is going to lead me to, a victory or a solution, right? So you need those two components, basically something that guesses what the good moves are, and then something that, essentially evaluates ends. And if you have both of those things, you can train those functions using something like reinforcement learning or behavior cloning if you have data. I mean, the basic idea for this goes back to Samuel's checker players from 1964. It's not recent. But of course was, the power of it was demonstrated with, AlphaGo and AlphaZero and things like that. So that's good, but that's a domain where humans suck. Humans are terrible at playing chess, right? And playing Go, like machines are much better than we are. Yeah. Because of the speed of tree exploration and because of the memory that's required for tree exploration. We just don't have enough memory capacity to do breadth first tree exploration. So we suck at it. Like, when AlphaGo came out, people before that thought that the best human players were maybe 2 or 3 stones handicap, like below an ideal player that they call God. Okay. Turns out, no, humans are terrible. Like the best players in the world need like 8 or 9 stones to get.
Well, I can't believe I get the pleasure to talk about game AI with Yann. I just have a few follow-up questions on this. The first one is this example that you talk about around humans being terrible at chess. And I'm familiar a bit with the development of chess AI over the years. I've heard this referred to as Moravec's paradox and explained as, humans have evolved over billions or millions, it's a large n number of years to physical locomotion. And that's why babies and humans are very good at this, but we have not evolved at all to play chess. So that's one question. And then a second question that's related is, a lot of people today who play video games, and I'm one of them, have observed that it feels like AI, at least in terms of like enemy AI, has not improved really in 20 years, right? That some of the best examples are still like Halo 1 and Fear from the early 2000s. So when do you think that, advancements that we've been doing in the lab are going to actually have real impact on like gamers, and in a non-like generative AI sense, right?
I used to be a gamer, never like an addicted one, but my family is in it because I have 3 sons in their 30s, and they have a video game design studio between them. So, so I'm sort of embedded in that culture. But you're right, and it's also true that despite the accuracy of physical simulators, a lot of those simulations are not used by studios who make animated movies because they want control. They don't necessarily want accuracy; they want control. And in games, it's really the same thing. It's a creative act. And what you want is some control about the course of the story or the way the NPC kind of behave and all that stuff, right? And using AI kind of is difficult to maintain control at the moment. So I mean, it will come, but there's some resistance from the creators. But I think Moravec paradox is very much still in force. So Moravec, I think formulated it in 1988, if I remember correctly. And he said, how come things that we think of as uniquely human intellectual tasks like playing chess, we can do with computers or computing integrals or whatever. But the thing that we take for granted, we don't even think is an intelligent task, like what a cat can do, we still can do with robots. And even now, 47 years later, we still can do them well. I mean, of course, we can, train robots, by imitation and a bit of reinforcement learning and, by training through simulation to kind of locomote and, avoid obstacles and do various things. But they're not nearly as inventive and creative and agile as a cat. It's not because we can't build a robot. We certainly can. It's just we can't make them smart enough to do all the stuff that a cat or even a mouse can do, let alone a dog or a monkey, right? So you have all those people bloviating about AGI in a year or two. It's just completely deluded. It's just complete delusion. Because the real world is way more complicated, and you're not going to get it. You're not going to get anywhere by tokenizing the world and using LLMs. It's just not going to happen. So
what is your timelines? When we will see I don't know, AGI, whatever it means,
and also where are you on the and where are you on the optimist pessimist side? Because there's some doomerism amongst Gary Marcus and I think I guess
Gary Marcus is not a doomer.
He's a critique. He critiques it. Sorry, the doomer would be is it Joshua?
Yeah.
There you go. Where do you fall on all these things?
Okay, I'll answer the first question first. Okay, so first of all, there is no such thing as general intelligence. This concept makes absolutely no sense because it's really designed to designate human level intelligence. But human intelligence is super specialized. Okay, we can handle the real world really well, like navigate and blah blah blah. We can handle other humans really well because we evolved to do this. And chess, we suck. Okay, so and there's a lot of tasks that we suck at where a lot of other animals are much better than we are. Okay, so what that means is that we are specialized. We think of ourselves as being general, but it's simply an illusion because all of the problems that we can apprehend are the ones that we can think of, right? And vice versa. And so we're general in all the problems that we can imagine. Okay, but there's a lot of problems that we cannot imagine. and there's some mathematical arguments for this, which I may not go into unless you ask me. But so this concept of general intelligence is complete BS. We can talk about human level intelligence, right? So are we going to have machines that are as good as humans in all the domains where humans are good, or better than humans? And the answer is, we already have machines that are better than humans in some domains. Like, we have machines that can translate, 1,500 languages into 1,500 other languages in any direction. No humans can do this, right? And there's a lot of examples in, chess and Go and various other things. But will we have machines that are as good as humans in all domains? The answer is absolutely yes. There is no question that at some point we'll have machines that are as good as humans in all domains. Okay, and that leads, but it's not going to be an event. It's going to be very progressive. We're going to make some conceptual advances, maybe based on JEPA world models, planning, things like that, over the next few years. And if we're lucky, if we don't hit an obstacle that we didn't see, perhaps this will lead to kind of good path to human level AI. But perhaps we're still missing a lot of basic concepts. And so the most optimistic view is that perhaps this, learning good world models and being able to do planning and understanding complex signals that are continuous, high-dimensional, noisy. If we make significant progress in that direction over the next 2 years, the most optimistic view is that we'll have something that is close to human intelligence, or maybe dog intelligence, within 5 to 10 years. Okay, but that's the most optimistic. It's very likely that, as what happened, multiple times in the history of AI in the past, there's some obstacle we're not seeing yet, which will, actually kind of require us to invent some new conceptual new things to kind of go beyond. In which case, that may take 20 years, maybe more. Okay, but no question it will happen. No question.
Do you think it will be easier to get from the current level to a dog level intelligence compared to a dog to humans level?
No, I think the hardest part is to get to dog level. Mm-hmm. Once you get to dog level, you basically have most of the ingredients, right? And then, what's missing from like primates to humans, beyond just size of the brain, is language, maybe, okay? But language is basically handled by the Wernicke area, which is a tiny little piece of brain that's right here, and the Broca area, which is a tiny piece of brain right here. Both of those evolved in the last, less than 1 million years, maybe 2. And it can be that complicated. And we already have LLMs that do a pretty good job at encoding language into abstract representations and then decoding thoughts into text. So maybe we'll use LLM for that. So LLM will be like the Wernicke and Broca areas in our brain. What we're working on right now is the prefrontal cortex, which is where our world model resides.
Well, this gets me into a few questions about safety and the destabilizing potential impacts. So I'll start this with something a little bit funny, which is to say, if we really get dog level intelligence, then the AI of tomorrow has gotten profoundly better than any human at smell. And something like that is just, tip of the iceberg for the destabilizing impacts of AI tomorrow, let alone today. I mean, we have Sam Altman talking about super persuasion because AI doxes you. So it figures out who you are through the multi-turn. So it gets really good at kind of customizing its arguments towards you. We've had AI psychosis, right? Like people who have done horrible things as a result of kind of believing in a sycophantic AI that is telling them to do things they shouldn't do.
Happened to me, by the way.
Whoa! You've got to tell us about that too. What?
Okay. One day, a few months ago, I was at NYU and I walked down to get lunch, and there's a dude who's surrounded by a whole bunch of police officers and security guards, and I walk past and the guy recognizes me and says, "Oh, Mr. LeCun."
Oh.
And the police officer kind of whisks me away outside and tells me, like, you don't want to talk to him. Turns out the guy had come from, the Midwest by bus to here.
Wow.
And he's kind of emotionally disturbed. He had gone through prison, blah, blah, blah. for kind of various things. And he was carrying a bag with, like a huge wrench and pepper spray and a knife. And so the security guards got alarmed and basically called the police.
Oh.
And then the police realized, okay, this guy is kind of weird. So they, took him away and had him examined. And eventually he went back to the Midwest. But I mean, he didn't feel threatening to me, but police wasn't so sure. So yeah, it happens. I had, high school students writing emails to me saying, I read all of those, pieces by doomers who say like, AI is going to take over the world and either kill us all or take our jobs. So like, I'm totally depressed. I don't go to school anymore. And blah, blah, blah. So I answer to them, say like, I don't believe all that stuff, but humanity is still going to be in control of all of this. Now, there's no question that, every powerful technology has, good consequences and bad side effects that sometimes are predicted and corrected sufficiently in advance, and sometimes not so much, right? And it's always a trade-off. That's a history of technological progress, right? So let's take cars as an example. Okay, cars crash sometimes, and initially, brakes were not that reliable, and cars would like flip over, and there was no, seat belts and blah blah blah, right? And eventually, kind of the industry made progress, and started putting seat belts and crumple zone and automatic kind of controlling systems so that the car doesn't go sway and doesn't flip or whatever. So cars now are much safer than they used to be. Now, there's one thing that is now mandatory in every car sold in the EU, and it's actually an AI system that looks out the window. It's called AEBS, Automatic Emergency Braking System. Mm-hmm. It's basically a conventional net, right? Mm-hmm. And it looks at the windshield, and it detects, all objects. And if it detects that an object is too close, it just automatically brakes. And if it detects that there's going to be a collision that the driver is not going to be able to avoid, it just stops the car and or sways, right? And that one statistics I read is that this reduces frontal collisions by 40%. And so it became mandatory equipment in every car sold in the EU, even low end, because it saves lives. Okay? So this is AI not killing people, saving lives, right? I mean, also same thing for like medical imaging and everything. There's a lot of life being saved by AI at the moment.
And like, but do you think, so you, Jeff and Joshua, right? Like both of you won the Turing Award together, and you have different opinions about it, right? And Jeff says like his regrets, and Joshua works on safety. And you trying to push it forward. And do you think you get to some level of intelligence that you will say, oh, this become too dangerous, we need to work more on the safety side?
I mean, you have to do it right. I'm going to use another example. Jet engines, okay? I find this astonishing that you can fly halfway around the world on a 2-engine airplane in complete safety. And I really say halfway around the world, like it's a 17-hour flight. Yeah. Okay. Can fly direct from New York to Singapore, right, on an Airbus 350. It's astonishing. And when you look at a jet engine, a turbofan, it should not work, right? I mean, there is no metal that can stand the type of temperature that takes place there. And the kind of like efforts when you have like a huge turbine, like, rotating at 2,000 RPM, or I don't know what speed, like the force that puts on it is just insane. It's hundreds of tons. So it should not be possible. Yet those things are incredibly reliable. So what I'm saying is you can't, build something like a turbojet. The first time you build it, it's not going to be safe. It's going to run for 10 minutes and then blow up. Okay. And it's not going to be fuel efficient, and it's, etc. It's not going to be reliable. But as you make progress in engineering and materials, etc., there's so much economic motivation to make this good that eventually it's going to be of the type of reliability we see today. The same is going to be true for AI. We're going to start making systems that have agency, can plan, can reason, have world models, blah blah blah. But they're going to have the power of maybe a cat brain, right? Which is about 100 times smaller than a human brain. And then we're going to put guardrails in them to prevent them from doing, taking actions that are obviously dangerous or something. And you can do this at a very low level. Like if you have, I don't know, a domestic robot, right? That so one example that Stuart Russell, for example, have used is to say, well, if you have a robot, a domestic robot, and you ask it to fetch you coffee, and someone is standing in front of the coffee machine, if the system wants to fulfill its goal, it's going to have to, either assassinate or smash the person in front of the coffee machine to get access to the coffee machine. And obviously, you don't want that to happen. Now, it's like the paperclip maximization. It's kind of a ridiculous example because it's super easy to fix this, right? You put some guardrail that say, well, you're a domestic robot, you should stay away from people, and maybe ask them to move if they are in the way, but not actually kind of, hurt them in any way or whatever. And you can do like, you can put a whole bunch of low-level conditions like this, like if you're a domestic robot and it's, it's a cooking robot, right? So it has a big knife in its hand and it's, cutting the cucumber. Don't flail your arms if you have a big knife in your hand and people around. Okay, it can be kind of a low-level constraint that the system has to satisfy. Now, some people say, oh, but with LLMs, we can fine-tune them to not do things that are dangerous, but there is always, you can jailbreak them. You can always find prompts where they're going to kind of escape their condition, all the things that we stop them from doing. I agree. That's why I'm saying we shouldn't use LLMs. We should use those objective-driven AI architectures I was talking about earlier, where you have a system that has a world model, can predict the consequences of its action, and can figure out a sequence of actions to accomplish a task, but also is subject to a bunch of constraints that guarantee that whatever action is being pursued and whatever state of the world is being predicted does not endanger anybody or does not have negative side effects. Right. So it's by construction, the system is intrinsically safe because it has all those guardrails, and because it obtains its output by optimization, by minimizing the objective of the task and satisfying the constraints of the guardrails, it cannot escape that. It's not a fine-tuning, right? It's by construction.
Yeah, and I'll there's a technique that for LLMs for constraining the output space where you say that you ban all outputs except whatever you want, like maybe 0 to 10 and everything else. And they have that even for diffusion models.
Sure.
Do you think that tactics like that as they exist today significantly improve the utility of those kinds of models?
Well, they do, but they're ridiculously expensive because the way they work is that you have to have the system generate lots of proposals for an output and then have a filter that says, well, this one is good, this one's terrible, etc., or rank them and then just put out the one that has the less toxic rating, essentially. Yeah. So it's insanely expensive, right? So unless you have some sort of objective-driven value function that kind of drives the system towards producing those high high score outputs, low toxicity outputs, it's going to be expensive.
Yeah, and I want to change the topic just a tiny bit off. We've been very technical for a moment, but I think our audience in the world has a few questions that are maybe a little bit more social related. The person who appears to be trying to fill your shoes in at Meta, Alex Wang, where I'm curious as to, do you have any thoughts or anything about, kind of how that will play out for Meta?
He's not in my shoes at all. He's in charge of all the R&D and product that are AI related at Meta. So he's not a researcher or scientist or or anything like that. It's more kind of, overseeing the entire operation. So within Meta Superintelligence Lab, which is his organization, there are 4 kind of divisions, if you want. So one of them is FAIR, which is long-term research. One of them is TBD Lab, which is basically building frontier models, which is mostly entirely LLM focused. A 4th organization is AI infrastructure, software infrastructure. Hardware is some other organization. And then the last one is products. Okay, so people who take the frontier models and then turn them into actual chatbots that people can use and disseminate them and plug them into WhatsApp and everything else, right? So those are 4 divisions. He oversees all of that. And there are several AI scientists. There is AI scientist of FAIR, that's me. And I really have a long-term view. And basically, I'm going to be at Meta for another, 3 weeks. Okay, so and FAIR is led by our NYU colleague Rob Fergus right now, after Joël Pinot left several months ago. FAIR is being pushed towards kind of working on slightly, shorter term projects that it has done in the traditionally, with less emphasis on publication, more focus on sort of helping TBD Lab with the LLMs and frontier models, and less publication, which means Meta is becoming a little more closed. And TBD Lab has a chief scientist also, but which is really focused on LLM. And the other organizations are more like infrastructure and products. So there's some applied research there. So for example, the group that works on SAM, segment anything, that's actually part of the product division of Meta. They used to be at FAIR, but because they worked on kind of relatively, kind of outside facing, kind of practical things, they were kind of moved to the product group.
And do you have any opinions on like some of the other companies that are trying to move into world models, like thinking machines, or even I've heard Jeff Bezos and some of his...
It's not clear at all what thinking machine is doing.
Not at all?
Maybe you have more information than me, but
maybe not. Sorry, maybe I'm mixing it up here. It's
physical intelligence.
Physical, sorry,
This is Fefe-Lee's company.
Fefe-Lee's, yes, sorry. Right. And then I mix them up with like SSI as well. They're all kind of like new.
SSI, nobody knows what they're doing, including their own investors.
Okay.
At least that's the rumor. That's the rumor I hear. I don't know if it's true. It's become a bit of a joke, but physical intelligence. Fife's company is focused on basically producing geometrically correct videos. Okay, where there is persistent geometry, and when you look at something and you turn around and you come back, it's the same object that you had before. It doesn't change behind your back, right? So it's generative, right? I mean, the whole idea is to generate pixels, okay? Which I just spent a long time arguing against. Right? That was a bad idea. There are other companies that have world model. A good one is Wayve. W-A-Y-V-E. So it's a company based in Oxford, and I'm an advisor, full disclosure, and they have a world model for autonomous driving. And the way they're training it is that they're training a representation space by basically training a VAE or VQ VAE, and then training a predictor to do temporal prediction in that abstract representation space. So they have half of it right and half of it wrong. The piece they have right is that you make predictions in representation space. The piece they have wrong is that they haven't figured out how to train their representation space in any other way than by reconstruction, and I think that's bad. Okay, but their model is great. Like, it works really well. I mean, among all the people who kind of work in this kind of stuff, they're pretty far advanced. There are people who talk about similar things at NVIDIA, a company called Sandbox AQ. The CEO of it, Jack Hillary, talks about quantitative models. large quantitative models as opposed to large language models. So basically, predictive models that can deal with continuous high-dimensional noisy data, right? Which is what also I've been kind of talking about. And Google, of course, has been working on, world models, mostly using generative approaches. There was an interesting effort at Google by Danesh Hafner. So he built models called Dreamer V1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
That was on a good path, except he just left Google to create his own startup.
Do you have, so I'm interested, so you were really criticized about the Silicon Valley culture that they are focusing on LLM. And this is like one of the reasons that now you started, that the new company is starting in at Paris, right? So this is something, do you think that we will see more and more, or do you think this is something will be very unique, that only a few companies will be in Europe?
Well, the company I'm starting is global, okay? It has an office in Paris, but it's a global company. There's an office in New York too. A couple other places. So, there is an interesting phenomenon in industry, which is that everybody has to do the same thing as everybody else. Because it's so competitive that if you start taking a tangent, you're taking a big risk of falling behind because you're using a different technology than everybody else, right? So basically everyone is trying to catch up with the others. And so that creates this herd effect. And a kind of monoculture, which is really specific to Silicon Valley, where, OpenAI, Meta, Google, Anthropic, everybody is basically working on the same thing. And, sometimes, like what happened a while back, another group, like DeepSeek in China comes up with kind of a new way of doing things. And everybody is like, what? Right? You mean like other people in Silicon Valley are not stupid and can come up with original ideas? There's a bit of a superiority complex, right? But you're basically in your trench, and you have to move as fast as possible because you can't afford to kind of fall behind the other guys who you think are your competitors. But you run the risk of being surprised by something that's completely out of the left field that uses a different set of technologies and or maybe addresses a different problem. What I've been interested in is completely orthogonal because the whole JEPA idea and world model is really to handle data that is not easily handled by LLMs. So the type of applications we're envisioning that have tons of applications in industry where the data comes to you in the form of continuous high-dimensional noisy data, including video, are domains where LLMs basically are not present, where people have tried to use them and totally failed, essentially, right? Okay, so if you don't want to be, so the expression in Silicon Valley is that you are LLM-pilled. You think that the path to superintelligence, you just scale up LLMs, you train on more synthetic data, you license some more data, you hire thousands of people to kind of find, to basically school your system in post-training. You invent a new tweaks on RL, and you're going to get to superintelligence. And this, I think, is complete bullshit. Like, it's just never going to work. And then you add a few, kind of reasoning techniques, which basically consist in, doing like super long chain of thoughts, and then having the system generate lots and lots of different token outputs, from which you can select good ones using some sort of evaluation function, the second LLM, basically, right? That's the way a lot of those things work. This is not going to take us there. It's just not. So you need to escape that culture. And there are people within all the companies in Silicon Valley who think like, this is never going to work. I want to do LLM and JEPA and blah, blah, blah. I'm hiring them. So escaping the monoculture of Silicon Valley, I think, is important. That's part of the story.
And what do you think about the competition between like the US, China, and Europe? Like, now that you are starting a company, like do you see more I know that there are some places that are more attractive than others.
We're in this very paradoxical situation where all the American companies, up till now, not Meta, but all the American companies have been kind of becoming really secretive, and to preserve their what they think is a competitive advantage. And by contrast, the Chinese players, companies and others, have been completely open. So the best open source systems at the moment are Chinese. And that causes a lot of the industry to use them because they want to use open source system. And they hold their nose a little bit because they know those models are kind of fine-tuned to not answer questions about politics and stuff like that, right? But they don't really have a choice. And certainly a lot of academic research now, uses the best Chinese models. Certainly everything that has to do with like reasoning and things like that, right? So it's really paradoxical, and a lot of people in the US, in the industry, are really unhappy about this. They really want a serious non-Chinese open source model. There could have been Llama 4, but Llama 4 was a disappointment for various reasons. Maybe that will get fixed with the new efforts at Meta, or maybe Meta will decide to go closed as well. It's not clear.
Mistral just had a model release.
Yeah, which is really cool for CodeGen. Yeah, that's right. No, it's cool. So yeah, they maintain openness. Yeah. No, it's really really interesting what they're doing.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay. Let's go to more personal questions.
Yeah.
So like you're 65, right? Years old. You won a Turing Award. You just got a Queen Elizabeth Prize. Basically, you could retire, right?
Yeah, I could. That's what my wife wants me to do.
So why to start a new company now? Like, what keep you up?
Because I have a mission. I mean, I always thought that either making people smarter or more knowledgeable, or making them smarter with the help of machines. So basically increasing the amount of intelligence in the world was an intrinsically good thing. Okay, intelligence is really kind of the commodity that is the most in demand. Certainly in like government. Okay. So, but like in every aspect of life, we are limited as as a species, as a planet, by the limited supply of intelligence, right? Which is why we spend enormous resources educating people and things like that. So increasing the amount of intelligence at the service of humanity or the planet more globally, not just humans, is intrinsically a good thing, despite all what the doomers are saying. Okay, of course you are dangerous and you have to protect against them. The same way you have to make sure your jet engine is safe and reliable, and your car, doesn't kill you with a small crash, right? But that's okay. That's an engineering problem. There's no like fundamental issue with that. Also a political problem, but it's not like unsurmountable. So that's an intrinsically good thing. And if I can contribute to this, I will. And basically all research projects I've done in my entire career, even those that were not related to machine learning, and my professional activities were all focused on either making people smarter. That's why I'm a professor. And that's why also I'm communicating publicly a lot about AI and science and things like that, and I have big presence on social networks and stuff like that, right? Because I think people should know stuff, right? But also on machine intelligence, because I think machines will assist humans and make them smarter. Okay, people think there is a fundamental difference between trying to make, machines that are intelligent and autonomous and blah, blah, blah. And it's a different set of technologies from trying to make machines that are assistive to humans. It's not, it's the same technology. It's exactly the same. And it's not because the system is intelligent or even a human is intelligent that it wants to dominate or take over. It's not even true of humans. Like, it's not the humans who are the smartest that want to dominate others. We see this on the international political scene every day. It's not the smartest among us who want to be the chief. And probably many of the smartest people that we've ever met are people who basically want nothing to do with the rest of humanity, right? They just want to work on their problems.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm
We all know them.
kind of stereotyping a little bit here.
That's what Hannah Arendt talks about, the vita contemplativa, right? Versus like the active life or the contemplative life, right? And her like philosophical analysis and like making a choice kind of early on what you work on.
Right.
Right.
But you can be, simultaneously kind of, a dreamer or contemplative, but have a big impact on the world, right? By, your scientific production. Like, think of Einstein or something.
Yeah.
Or even Newton. Like, Newton basically didn't want to meet anybody.
Famously.
Or Paul Dirac. Paul Dirac was kind of, practically autistic.
Well, is there like a paper or idea you haven't written, or something else that you're nagging that you want to get to, or maybe that you don't have time, or any regret?
Oh yeah, a lot. Oh, my entire career has been a succession of me not devoting enough time to express my ideas and writing them down, and mostly getting scooped.
What is the most significant one?
I don't want to go through that. But backprop is a good one.
Okay.
Okay. I published some sort of early version of some algorithm to train multilayer nets, which today we would call target prop. And I had the whole backprop thing figured out, except I didn't write it before. They were more hard than Jeff Hinton. They were nice enough to cite my earlier paper in theirs. But so there's been a few of those, recurrent nets, and, various other things. But and things that are more perhaps more recent. But I have no regrets about this. Like, this is life. Like, I'm not going to say, I invented this in 1991 and I should have.
Like some other people.
I don't know if I should say the name, but, we all know.
Well, I mean,
if you know, you know.
The way ideas pop up, is relatively complex. It's rare that someone comes up with an idea in complete isolation and that, nobody else comes up with similar ideas at the same time. Most of the time they appear simultaneously. But then there's various ways to just having the idea, and then there is kind of writing it down, but there's also writing it down in a sort of convincing way, in a clear way. And then there is kind of making it work on toy problems, maybe. Okay, and then there is making the theory that shows that it can work. And then there is making it work on a real application, right? And then there is making a product out of it. Okay, so this whole chain. And, some people, a little extreme, think that the only person who should get all the credit is the very first person who got the idea. I think that's wrong. There's a lot of really difficult steps to get this idea to the state where it actually works. So this idea of world model, goes back to the 1960s. People in optimal control had world models to do planning. That's the way NASA, planned the trajectory of the rockets to go to orbit. Basically simulating the rocket and sort of by optimization figuring out the control law to get the rocket to where it needs to be. So that's an old idea, very old idea. The fact that you could do some level of training or adaptation in this is called system identification in optimal control. Very old idea too. Goes back to the 70s. It's something called system identification, or even MPC, where you adapt the model as it goes, like while you're running the system. That goes back to the 70s, to some obscure paper in France. And then the fact that you can just learn a model from data. People have been working on this with neural nets since the 1980s, right? And not just Jürgen. It's like a whole bunch of people who've been working. People who came from optimal control and realized they could use neural nets as kind of a universal function approximator and use it for direct control or feedback control or world models for planning, blah, blah, And like a lot of things in neural nets in the 1980s and 90s, it kind of worked, but not like to the point where it took over the industry. So it's the same for, computer vision, speech recognition. There were attempts at using neural nets for that back in those days. But it started really, really working well in the late 2000s, where it totally took over, right? And then early 2010s for vision, mid 2010s for NLP, and for robotics, it's starting. Okay, but it's not.
Why you think it's only like in this time started to get over the
Well, it's a
world?
combination of like having the right state of mind about it and the right mindset, having the right architectures, the right machine learning techniques, like, residual connections, real use, whatever. Then having powerful enough computers and having access to data. And it's only when those planets are aligned that you get a breakthrough, right? Which appears like a conceptual breakthrough, but it's actually just a practical one. Okay, let's talk about convolutional nets, okay? Lots of people during the 70s had the idea, or even during the 60s actually, had the idea of using local connections, like building a neural net with local connections for extracting local features. And the idea that local features is like convolution, like in image processing, is like, goes back to the 60s. So these are not new concepts. The fact that you can learn adaptive filters of this type using data goes back to the perceptron and Adeline, which is early 60s. Okay, but that's only for one layer. Now, the concept that you can train a system with multiple layers, everybody was looking for this in the 60s. Nobody found, a lot of people made proposals, which kind of half worked, but like none of them was convincing enough for people to say, okay, this is a good technique. One technique that was adopted is what's called polynomial classifiers. So now we would turn this into kernel methods, but it's, basically you sort of have a handcrafted feature extractor, and then you train basically what amounts to a linear classifier on top of it. That was kind of common practice in the 70s and certainly 80s. But the idea that you could train a nonlinear system, a system composed of multiple nonlinear steps using gradient descent. The basic concept for this goes back to the Kelly-Bryson algorithm, which is optimal control. It was mostly linear from 1962. And people in optimal control kind of wrote things about this, in the 60s. But nobody realized you could use this for machine learning to do pattern recognition or to do, natural language processing. Mm-hmm. That really only happened after, the Rumelhart-Hinton-Williams paper in 1985, even though people had proposed the very same algorithm a few years before. Like Paul Grabos, proposed, what he called ordered derivatives, which turns out to be backprop, but it's the same thing as the adjoint state method in optimal control. So like those ideas, the fact that an idea or a technique is reinvented multiple times in different fields, and then only after the fact, people say, oh, right, it's actually the same thing. And we knew about this before. We didn't realize we could use this for it, for this particular stuff, right? So all those like claims of plagiarism, it's just a complete misunderstanding of how ideas come about.
Okay. What do you do when you're not thinking about AI?
I have a whole bunch of hobbies that have very little time to actually partake in. I like sailing, so I go sailing in the summer. I like sailing multi-hull boats like trimaran, catamarans. I have a bunch of boats. I like building flying contraptions. So
a modern Da Vinci.
I wouldn't call them airplanes because a lot of them don't look like airplanes at all. But they do fly. Okay. I like the sort of concrete creative act of that. My dad was aerospace engineer and mechanical engineer working in the aerospace industry, and he was building airplanes as a hobby and building his own radio control system and stuff like that. And he got me and my brother into it. My brother who works at Google Research
in France,
in Paris, and that became kind of a family activity, if you want. So my brother and I still do this, but and then in the COVID years, I picked up astrophotography. So I have a bunch of telescopes and take pictures of the sky. And I build electronics. So since I was a teenager, I was interested in music. I was playing Renaissance and Baroque music, and also some type of folk music. Playing wind instruments, woodwinds, but I was also into electronic music. And my cousin, who was slightly older than me, was an aspiring electronic musician. So he had like analog synthesizers, and because I knew electronics, I would modify them for him. And I was still in high school at the time. And now in my home, I have a whole bunch of synthesizers, and I build electronic musical instruments. So these are wind instruments.
Wow.
You blow into them. There's fingering and stuff, but what they produce is control signals for the synthesizer.
Oh, it's cool. Very cool.
I've heard a lot of people in tech are into sailing. Gotten that answer, surprising amount. I'm going to start trying to sail now.
Okay, so I tell you something about sailing. It's very much like the world model story. To be able to, kind of control the sailboat properly, to make it go as fast as possible and everything, you have to anticipate a lot of things. You have to anticipate the motion of the waves, like how the waves are going to affect your boat. Whether a gust of wind is going to come and have to, start, the boat is going to start heeling and things like that. And you basically have to run CFD in your head because you have to figure out like the, fluid dynamics. You have to figure out like what is the flow of air around the sails. And you know that if the angle of attack is too high, it's going to be turbulent on the back, and the lift is going to be much lower. So blah blah blah. So like tuning sails is basically requires running CFD in your head, but at an abstract level. You're not solving the Navier-Stokes, right? But you have really good intuitive. So that's what I like about it. Like the whole thing that you have to build this mental, predictive model of the world to be able to do a good job.
The question is how many samples you need.
Yeah, probably a lot. but you get to learn it only in a few years of practice. And
yeah. Okay. You're French, and you lived in the US for many decades already. Do you still feel French? Does that perspective shape your view of the world, of the American tech culture?
Well, inevitably, yeah. I mean, you can't completely escape your upbringing and your culture. So, I mean, I feel both French and American in the sense that, I've been in the US for 37 years and in North America for 38 because I was in Canada before. Or children grew up in the US. And so, from that point of view, I'm American, but I have a view certainly on various aspects of science and society that probably are, a consequence of growing up in France. Yeah, absolutely. And I feel French when I'm in France.
I'm curious. I did not actually realize that you had a brother that also worked in tech. I'm fascinated by this because Joshua Bengio's brother also works in tech, and I always thought that he was the only Serena Venus Williams situation in AI. But you too also have a brother. So how many more AI research? Like is it that common that it just runs in families?
I have no idea. I don't know. I also have a sister who is not in tech, but she's also a professor. My brother was a professor before he moved to Google.
Wow.
And he doesn't work on AI or machine learning. He's very careful not to. He's a younger brother. He's 6 years younger than me. And he works on operations research and optimization, essentially. Which now is actually also being invaded by machine learning. So he has no...
Yeah. Okay, one more question. So, if the world models work in 20 years from now, what is the dream? How does it look like? How does our lives will be?
Total world domination. Okay, no, it's a joke. It's a joke. It's a joke. I say this sentence because this is what Linus Torvalds used to say. He said, like, what's your goal with Linux? And he said, total world domination. And I thought that was super funny. And it actually succeeded. I mean, basically, to first approximation, every computer in the world runs Linux.
Yeah,
there's only a few desktops that don't, and a few iPhones, but, everything else runs Linux. So, no, really, like, having, pushing towards like a recipe for training and building intelligent systems, perhaps all the way to human intelligence or more, and basically building AI systems that would, help people and humanity more generally in their daily lives at all times, amplifying human intelligence. We'll be their boss, right? It's not like those things are going to dominate us, because again, it's not because something is intelligent that it wants to dominate. Those are two different things. In humanity, we are hardwired to having to influence other people. And sometimes it's through domination, sometimes it's through prestige. But we're hardwired by evolution to do this because we are a social species. There's no reason we would build those kind of drive into our intelligent systems. And it's not like they're going to develop those kinds of drives by themselves. So yeah, I'm quite optimistic.
Me too.
So am I.
All right.
Okay, so we have final questions from the audience. So yeah, let's start. If you were starting your AI career today, what skills and research directions would you focus on?
I get this question a lot from young students or parents of future students. So what area should we? I mean, I think you should learn things that have a long shelf life, and you should learn things that help you learn to learn, because technology is evolving so quickly that you want kind of the ability to learn really quickly, and basically that is done by learning very busy. So in the context of STEM, right, science and technology, engineering, mathematics. I'm not talking about humanities here. This is, although you should learn philosophy. This is done by learning things that have a long shelf life. So the joke I say is that first of all, the things that have a long shelf life tend to not be computer science. Okay, so here's a computer science professor, arguing against studying computer science.
Don't come to study.
And I have a terrible confession to make, which is I studied electrical engineering as an undergrad, so I'm not a real computer scientist. Okay, but what we should do is learn kind of basic things in mathematics, in modeling, mathematics that can be connected with reality. You tend to learn this kind of stuff in engineering. In some schools, that's linked with computer science, but sort of, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, etc., engineering disciplines. You learn in the US calculus 1, 2, 3. That gives you a good basis, right? Mm-hmm. Computer science, you can get away with just calculus 1. That's not enough, right? Learning, probability theory and linear algebra, all the stuff that are really kind of basic. And then if you do electrical engineering, things like, control theory or signal processing, like all of those methods, optimization, all of those methods are really useful for things like AI. And then you can basically learn similar things in physics, because physics is all about, like, what should I represent about reality to be able to make predictive models, right? And that's really what intelligence is about. So I think you can learn most of what you need to learn, also if you go through a physics curriculum. But obviously, you need to learn enough computer science to kind of program and use computers. And even though AI is going to help you be more efficient at programming, you still need to know, like, how to do this.
What do you think about Wayve coding?
I mean, it's cool. It's going to cause a funny kind of thing where a lot of the code that will be written will be used only once, right? Because it's going to become so cheap to write code, right? You're going to ask your kind of AI assistant, like, produce this graph or like, do this research, blah, 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 and it's going to write a little piece of code to do this. Or maybe it's an applet that you need to play with for a little simulator, and you're going to use it once and throw it away because it's so cheap to produce, right? So the idea that we're not going to need programmers anymore is false. We're going to, the cost of generating software, has been going down continuously for decades, and that's just the next step of the cost going down. But it doesn't mean computers are going to be less useful; they're going to be more useful.
Okay, one more question. So, what do you think about the connection between neuroscience and machine learning? There are some ideas a lot of time that AI borrows from neuroscience and the other way, right? I know predictive coding, for example. Do you think that it's useful to use ideas from?
But there's a lot of inspiration you can get from neuroscience, from biology in general, but neuroscience in particular. I certainly was very influenced by classic work in neuroscience, like Hubel and Wiesel's work on the architecture of the visual cortex is basically what led to convolutional nets, right? And I wasn't the first one to use those ideas in artificial neural nets, right? There were people in the 60s trying to do this. There were people in the 80s building locally connected networks with multiple layers. They didn't have ways to train them with backprop. There was the cognitron and neocognitron from Fukushima, which had a lot of the ingredients, just not proper learning algorithm. And there was another kind of aspect of the cognitron, which is that it was really meant to be a model of the visual cortex. So it tried to reproduce every quirks of biology. For example, the fact that in the brain, you don't have positive and negative weights. You have positive and negative neurons. So all the neurons, all the synapses coming out of an inhibitory neuron have negative weights.
Yeah.
Okay. And all the synapses coming out of non-inhibitory neurons have positive weights. So Fukushima implemented this in his model, right? He implemented the fact that neurons spike. So he didn't have a spiking neuron model, but you cannot have a negative number of spikes. And so his function was basically rectification, like a ReLU, except it had a saturation.
Yeah.
And then he knew from various works that there was some sort of normalization, and he had to use this because otherwise there was no backprop, so the activation in his network would go haywire. So we had to do like divisive normalization. That turns out to actually be correspond to some theoretical models of the visual cortex that some of our colleagues at the Center for Neuroscience at NYU had been pushing, like David Heeger and people like that. So, I think neuroscience is a source of inspiration. More recently, the sort of macro architecture of the brain in terms of, perhaps the world model and planning and things like this, like how is that reproduced? Like, why do we have a separate module in the brain for factual memory, the hippocampus, right? And we see this now in certain neural net architectures, that there is like a separate memory module, right? Maybe it's a good idea. I think what's going to happen is that we're going to come up with sort of new AI neural net architectures, deep learning architectures, and a posteriori we'll discover that the characteristics that we implemented in them actually exist in the brain. And in fact, that's a lot of what's happening now in neuroscience, which is that there is a lot of feedback now from AI to neuroscience, where the best models of human perception are basically convolutional nets today.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have anything else that you want to add, to say to the audience? Whatever you want.
I think we covered a lot of grounds. I think you want to be careful who you listen to. So don't listen to AI scientists talking about economics. Okay. So when some AI person or even a business person tells you AI is going to put everybody out of work, talk to an economist. Basically, none of them is saying anything anywhere close to this. Okay. And, the effect of technological revolutions on the labor market is something that a few people have devoted their career on doing. None of them is predicting massive unemployment. None of them is predicting that radiologists are going to be all unemployed, etc. Right? Also realize that actually fielding practical applications of AI so that they are sufficiently reliable and everything is super difficult and is very expensive. And in previous waves of interest in AI, the techniques that people had put a big hope in turned out to be overly unwieldy and expensive, except for a few applications. So there was a big wave of interest in expert systems back in the 1980s. Japan started a huge project called the Fifth Generation Computer Project, which was like computers with CPUs that were going to run Lisp and inference engines and stuff, right? And the hottest job in the late 80s was going to be knowledge engineer. You were going to sit next to an expert and then turn the knowledge of the expert into rules and facts, right? And then the computer would be able to basically do what the expert was. This was manual behavior cloning, okay? And it kind of worked, but only for a few domains where economically it made sense and it was doable at a level of reliability that was good enough. But it was not a path towards kind of human level intelligence. And so the idea somehow, like the delusion that people today have that the current AI mainstream, fashion is going to take us to human intelligence has happened already 3 times during my career and probably 5 or 6 times before, right? You should see what people were saying about the perceptron, right? There was a New York Times article. People were saying, oh, we're going to have like super intelligent machines within 10 years. Marvin Minsky in the 60s says, oh, within 10 years, the best chess player in the world would be a computer. It took a bit longer than that. This happened over and over again. In 1956 or something, when Newell and Simon produced the general problem solver, very modestly called the general problem solver. Okay, what they thought was really cool. They say, okay, the way we think is very simple. We pose a problem. There is a number of different solutions to that problem, different proposals for solution, a space of potential solutions. Like you do like traveling salesman, right? There is a number of factorial, n factorial. Possible paths. You just have to look for the one that is the best, right? And they say like every problem can be formulated this way, essentially, for a search for the best solution. If you can formulate the problem as an objective by writing a program that checks whether it's a good solution or not, or gives a rating to it, and then you have a search algorithm that searches through the space of possible solution for one that optimizes that score, then you solve AI. Okay, now what they didn't know at the time is all of complexity theory, that basically every problem that is interesting is exponential or NP-complete or whatever, right? And so, we have to use heuristic programming, kind of come up with heuristics for every new problem.
Yeah.
And basically, the general problem solver was not that general. So like this idea somehow that the latest idea is going to take you to, AGI or whatever you want to call it, is very dangerous, and a lot of very smart people fell into that trap many times over the last 7 decades.
Do you think that the field will ever figure out continual or incremental learning?
Sure. Yeah, that's not a technical problem.
Well, I thought catastrophic forgetting, right? Because your weights that you trained so much money on get overwritten.
Sure. So you train just a little bit of it. I mean, we already do this with SSL, right? We train a foundation model. Like for video or something like JEPA2, produces really good representations of video. And then if you want to train the system for a particular task, you train a small head on top of it. And that head can be, learned continuously. And even your one model can be trained continuously. That's not an issue. I don't see this as like a huge challenge, frankly. In fact, Raya Hetzel, Pierre Samanet, and I, and a few of our colleagues back in 2005, 2006, built a learning-based navigation system for mobile robots that had this kind of idea. So it was convolutional net that was doing semantic segmentation from camera images. And on the fly, the top layers of that network would be adapted to the current environment. So it would do a good job. And the labels came from short-range traversability that were indicated by stereo vision, essentially. So yeah, I mean, you can do this. It's particularly if you have multimodal. Yeah, I don't see this as a big challenge.
It's been a pleasure to have you.
All right, it was a real pleasure to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.